Very warm welcome to the Rifleman's Museum. It's been the Rifleman's Museum now for about a month, and that really celebrates our new partnership with the Rifles. And we're going to be doing quite a lot of work downstairs in the museum towards the end of this year, really allowing the Rifles' heritage to flow from where it started right through into the current regiment. There'll be a new display downstairs, which will be really, really good. I'll tell you about that. As you probably know, this used to be the Rifle Regiment depot. It's now multi-million-pound houses. I can assure you that the bed spaces weren't like that when it was the depot. The officers' mess used to be down the hill, and there were some steps that went from the square down to the officers' mess, and they were the most awkward bloody steps you could have ever had. You know, the ones that you sort of do one pace and then 2 paces all the way down. And the myth was that they were built by French prisoners. That was the myth. I have absolutely no idea whether it's true. We may find out tonight. I'm not sure. But a very warm welcome, Paul. He's going to talk about Napoleon's lost soldiers and seamen, French prisoners in Hampshire. And we're looking forward very much to hearing what you want to say.
Okay, great. Thank you. Thank you. Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. As mentioned, there were prisoners of war held here on this site when Winchester Palace existed. And this was during the 7 Years' War and the American War of Independence. But I'm going to talk about the Napoleonic period, when many thousands of captives came to this country, especially to Hampshire. And to start, we'll start with a quote from the man himself. "Soldiers, let those among you who have been prisoners of the English describe to you the hulks and detail the miseries they have endured." And this is one of his sort of speeches to his soldiers on the eve of the campaign of Waterloo, trying to whip up an anti-British fervour amongst them and reminding them that many of them had spent many years in captivity before the war ended in 1814. And many of them spent some time on board the infamous prison ships or hulks. But as I shall relate, the reason why they spent so long was because of himself. A bit later on about that. His reference to the hulks inspired dread amongst these men, but the prison system wasn't just about prison ships. It was also about land prisons and parole depots as well. It was a nationwide system. And the numbers of prisoners that we are talking about, between 1793 and 1815, something in the region of 200,000 captives were brought to this country to reside in those 3 different types of prison depot. 1803, 1814, the Napoleonic period proper, just over 122,000 came here. It wasn't just French. It was all the different nationalities swept up in Napoleon's armies. It would be Germans, Italians, Poles, for example. Americans came here as well from the War of 1812. There were all sorts of neutral men as well, people who'd been working on board enemy merchant vessels and privateers who got captured and found themselves in the prison depots. So just about every nationality in Europe found themselves in the prison depots of Hampshire and of this country. It was men, women, and children. It was black prisoners, white prisoners. It was military and civilian prisoners. Everybody was caught up in this worldwide conflict at that time. The war at sea, being an island nation, we have a big navy, so a lot of the prisoners are going to come from the war on the oceans. Trafalgar generated 7,500 prisoners of war. Camperdown, about 3,500. There were smaller actions all around the globe, and so there was a constant flow of captives coming in from these major actions at sea, but also in the war on trade as well. While we see large hauls of prisoners arriving in the depots from the major battles, be they at sea or later on land as well, there was a continuous trickle of captives coming into all the depots from the war against trade, capturing enemy merchant vessels and privateers, the commerce raiders. And so there was a continuous flow of captives coming into the system all the time. The Great Terror, Napoleon's planned invasion of the south coast of England. It didn't actually happen, but many of the men involved in his invasion armada arrived here as prisoners of war. By that, I mean many thousands of them, because the Royal Navy tried to disrupt that invasion armada by attacking shipping along the north coast of Europe as it was being assembled at the invasion ports. So thousands of soldiers and seamen and civilians got swept up into captivity during this 1803-1805 period of the Great Terror. In fact, so many were coming into the country at the time, and as I shall relate, it was deemed a bit dubious as will keep so many of them near a major naval base such as Portsmouth. So for the first few years of the conflict in the Napoleonic conflict, few prisoners were kept in Hampshire. But by 1805, there were so many prisoners coming into the system, many from this action, that Dartmoor Prison was planned in 1805 and started building in 1806. And for various reasons, it wasn't open until 1809, but then the Peninsular Wars all kicked in, so it was ideal for that. The Dartmoor Prison is a sort of direct result of thousands of these men coming into the country. The war on trade was an important part of the sort of war at that time. And most European nations had colonies out in the West Indies, which Britain would attempt to wrest from them, and successfully did on many an occasion. This meant that the businesses that European merchants had, French merchants had with those colonies, was no longer there. So many of them fitted out privateers or commerce raiders to try and wrest back some of that business and attack the British merchant shipping that was taking advantage of this new commerce out there. And so many thousands of privateer crewmen were captured in the West Indies and found themselves in the war prison depots of Hampshire. Now, a privateer was a privately owned and armed commerce raider. They had very large crews on board, typically 100, 120, sometimes 150 for some of the larger privateers. So it meant that when one of these vessels was captured, there was quite a large haul of prisoners coming into the system. The West Indies generated large hauls from time to time. 1796, 4,000 prisoners of war arrived in Portchester Castle from the West Indies, many of them black soldiers and seamen. So this was a very important part of the conflict at that time, generating many thousands of prisoners. The war on land generated thousands of captives. The colonial warfare I've just mentioned there, all around the world, colonies, enemy colonies were attacked and generated captives. From 1808 onwards, we were involved in the Peninsular campaign, and certainly by 1809, this was becoming a major source of captives for the war prison system at the time. So much so that in 1810, Portchester Castle was reopened as a prison depot, specifically to sort of handle captives coming from the Peninsular theatre. And so many of them were coming in, and the sort of southern depots were full by 1812, that a new prison was built up at Perth to cope with the Peninsular captives. But the war on land, while it generated many prisoners of war for the system, also generated a major source of recruits for Britain. The Germans, Dutch and Poles and Italians could be recruited into British service, as I shall relate later on. The system was run by the Admiralty, the Transport Office of the Admiralty, situated in Somerset House in London. If you've ever been to Somerset House and walked up, you've got to head for heights of the Nelson Stairs there. Those rooms at the top of those stairs was where this system was administered. And it was a nationwide system, but they also had depots out in places like Jamaica and Bermuda and North America as well, and Malta. And it was all administered from offices in that building. And the Transport Office consisted of a number of commissioners, both naval and civilian, and they oversaw the three different types of prison depot. The prison ships at Portsmouth, Plymouth and Chatham had an agent, a naval officer, a captain in charge of the whole depot, but each ship had a naval officer, a naval lieutenant in command. The land prisons, such as Portchester and Forton, had an agent who was a naval officer of the rank of captain. And the parole depots, the agent was a civilian of some standing in the community. The garrisons at the prison ships were Royal Marines and militia, who were sort of rotated around the depots. The land prisons had militia guarding the prisons. And the parole depots didn't have garrisons as such, but if there was a disturbance amongst the prisoners, the local troops of yeomanry could be called out to quell that disturbance, put on a show of force. And these commissioners were accessible to everybody. They would regularly tour the prison depots to see how things were being done on a day-to-day basis. And they were accessible to the prisoners. So if the prisoner had a grievance in the depot, if he wasn't getting redress from the agent there, he could actually speak to the commissioner when he came down and so put his case forward. On many an occasion, some of these commissioners pointed out that some of the Frenchmen approaching them seemed to be of a miserable disposition and complained a lot. So you get whingers in every community. But if the commissioner thought that something could be improved, or he'd seen something that had worked well in one depot in the country, he'd recommend it at another depot. So the system was constantly evolving and improving. The prison ships, there were 55 ships in use during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic period at Portsmouth, Plymouth and Chatham. And I particularly like this French engraving because it shows you these workings of the ship. You see this walkway at sea level, sentry boxes there for the sentries to shelter in. That building there is for the stowage of the hammocks during the day. And these aren't signal flags, that's the prisoners' laundry there as well. But copiously supplied with sentry boxes and places for the soldiers to view what was going on. Occasionally, surprisingly, prisoners did attempt to tunnel out of these ships. So they had to be very careful, you know, have this walkway around there to make sure that nothing untoward was going on. The Portsmouth Plymouth ship depot, in the Revolutionary period, there were 11 ships in use. And I've highlighted 3 particular years where the system increased because of what was happening in the world at the time. When war broke out in 1803, it was deemed unwise to have too many of these prisoners situated in a major naval base. So there was just one prison ship in Portsmouth Harbour. By 1806, 3 of those ships, of that 7, were exclusively for Trafalgar prisoners that had come in, large haul from Trafalgar. And also those prisoners being captured from Napoleon's invasion armada as well. So the prison establishment, the prison population was increasing. Then you get 1808, you suddenly find this big jump to 11, because the Peninsular War is kicking in. Aside from all the privateers being captured around the world and some activities in the colonies, those particular events were causing quite a dramatic increase in the prison establishment. Even though by 1806, the threat of invasion had receded because of Trafalgar and Napoleon's interest in Central Europe, there was still a lot of activity going on around the world generating captives for the system. Now the Portsmouth hulks, here's a nice little picture of the line of Portsmouth hulks at the north end of Portsmouth Harbour, one of the sort of prison ships painted by a French prisoner of war. In 1798, the Fortitude in Portsmouth Harbour was home to 750 black prisoners taken in the French service. The San Tommaso held just over 800 Dutch prisoners. The nationalities tended to be kept separate because while some of these, for example, later on in the war, while the Spanish and French might have been allies politically, they weren't allies in terms of their sort of personal preferences down at the sort of bottom end of the social scale. So they kept the sort of nationalities separate. The Prothe prison ship held 148 French naval officers who had been refused their parole for one reason or another, and 264 boys captured on merchant vessels and privateers. Of those youngsters, 3 of them were 9 years of age, 5 of 10, and 32 of 11 years of age. So a lot of youngsters were swept up into this system. You might think, well, why weren't they sent home? Women and children under the age of 12 were considered non-combatants and could go home on the next available cartel. But bear in mind that a lot of these youngsters, their home and their family was the merchant vessel or the warship they were serving on. So they didn't have a home. So you were just dumping an orphan on the other side of the channel if you sent them straight home. So it took some while for some of these youngsters to arrange to get back to their own country. This is what the prison ship looked like on the inside. There's the prisoners at work and play. The hammocks have been stowed in that building on top of the ship. But this is the orlop deck of the Brunswick prison ship at Chatham. It was 125 feet in length, 40 feet in breadth, and height 4 feet 10 inches. Up there. At night, there were 460 prisoners in there, sleeping in those hammocks. There was only 431 who had space for a hammock, so the rest had to sleep on the deck board. And the orlop deck was ventilated by 14 gun ports, which were barred but unglazed. So if they wanted to keep the sort of wind out, they put blankets over them. And it was said that the atmosphere became so stifling, even in winter, and in summer, the prisoners went about naked to obtain some relief from the heat. And it was said that the guards, when they removed the hatch covers, had to stand back because of the onrush of stench coming up from that deck. There were prisoners who were in this environment for many years. Some of the prisoners who arrived in the country in 1803 weren't released until 1814. And some of them spent some time in this environment like that. But it wasn't a foregone conclusion that a prisoner would spend the whole of his captivity in a prison ship. That prison ship needed refurbishment or taking out of service. He might be moved to another ship or to a land depot as well. And prisoners, if they could get convince the surgeon that this was affecting their health seriously, the surgeon would recommend they be sent to one of the land depots. It was a bit healthier. The prisoners were moved around the system constantly during this period. This is what every best dressed prisoner of war was wearing at that time. An outfit made of a sulphur yellow colour with TO for Transport Office stamped on it. There were two reasons they wore this brightly coloured material. First, you knew they were a prisoner of war. If they escaped from the depot, they were easily recognisable. But also, many prisoners had a penchant for gambling, and many of them gambled away their food, clothing and bedding ration. And a lot of the soldiers of the garrison, especially the wives of the soldiers of these garrisons, were implicit in this material, and also a lot of these prisoners would sell their clothing to unofficial provision buyers amongst their number who prey upon their weaker-minded colleagues, who would then sell it on to other prisoners or to the soldiers of the garrison and the women of the garrison. An example is Mrs. Nelson, whose husband was doing duty at Norman Cross prison depot. She was found travelling to market with her horse and cart one day, with her cart piled high with this prison clothing. She was arrested, taken back to the depot, put in a locked room with her husband, while the sergeant went off to find an officer to interrogate them. And in the intervening few minutes, they both disappeared, legged it, and were never seen or heard of again. But this was a serious problem in this material was being sold outside of the prison depots. So if it was brightly coloured like that, and that started appearing in the local community, it could be traced back to its source, and they could actually prosecute whoever was involved in the trade. The food ration was very similar to that given the seamen in the Royal Navy, except that it was delivered fresh every week to the prisoners. And it was supplied by local contractors, and who would have the contract or supplying £1.5 pound of bread, half a pound of beef, 2 fish days each week, and note the cabbage, I'll come on to that in a minute, or other vegetables that were substituted depending on what was in season, plus salt beer, and 2 pints of small beer. They could buy extra beer in the prison canteens, and this is one of the perks of turnkeys and clerks in these depots, that they could manage and run those canteens and sell extra small beer to the prisoners, but not strong beer or spirits. That was all totally banned. And so clerks and turnkeys made a nice little profit out of selling to the prisoners their small beer. One of the constant problems facing all the prison depots at that time was when French seamen arrived, many of them would be suffering from scurvy in various stages. The Royal Navy has just about got it under control by the mid-1790s, although it did occur on board Royal Navy ships. But this was a constant problem in all the French ships captured. So when they're coming into the prison depot and getting this cabbage, getting their vitamin C, plus lime juice supplied by the surgeon, who get it all sent up from Deptford to the prison depots, they were cured of it. So the healthcare system in the prison at the time was very, very good for these men. Regarding the food, each barrack in all the prison depots and each prison ship had a committee of prisoners who were allowed to oversee the delivery and distribution of this food ration. And they could work with the agent and his staff, and if they felt that some of the ration, sometimes the bread, but particularly the meat, was of substandard quality, they could complain to the agent. And the agent would investigate, and if he felt that they were justified in their complaint, he would tell the contractor to go and replace it with some good quality meat. So the prisoners would get better quality meat as per the regulations, but the contractor wasn't going to be done out of his money. What he would do is sell that substandard meat to the local population. So prisoners of war, on many an occasion, were eating better than some of the local civilian population at that time. And despite whatever the cost of living was during this whole period, whatever the sort of corn harvest was doing, prisoners of war always got this ration, despite the cost of it. And there was often quite some debate around the country about prisoners of war eating quite well inside the depots when the local people weren't getting meat every day or having to scrape together money to find bread. These are the land prisons. The prison depots in Hampshire were part of a nationwide system. The only three purpose-built prisons were Norman Cross, Dartmoor and Perth. All the others had been fortifications, old prisons or warehouses or whatever that had been in use throughout the 18th century, were just refurbished and expanded for the Napoleonic period. Portchester Castle had been in use since the sort of Dutch Wars of the 1660s. So that was used throughout the 18th century. Remember, we were at war with France, Spain and Holland quite frequently in the 18th century. So war prison system was needed in that time. The Napoleonic period generated the largest number of captives for the 18th, 19th centuries. And prisoners could be moved around the system. So in 1797, a new depot was opened at Norman Cross near Peterborough. Because there was immediately space available for prisoners, a few thousand prisoners of war from Portchester Castle, where there was overcrowding, were marched north up the Great North Road to reside there. If you ever go to Stevenage, to the White Lion pub, there's a little plaque on the wall there that says that French prisoners on their march north were housed there overnight. So a lot of the sort of taverns and hotels all along the route would sort of look after these men overnight, and the soldiers guarding them as well. So if you had a land prison in your vicinity, if you had prisoners marching through your vicinity, this was boom time for the local economy. You sell them food, you sell them drink, and you sell them bedding as well, and perhaps candles for illumination at night. So you do very well out of trading with the government for these prisoners of war. In Hampshire, there were two land prisons, Portchester Castle and Forton Prison. Now, while the war began in 1803, you'll note that Portchester wasn't opened until 1810 and Forton 1807, when the threat of French invasion had receded, but there were large numbers of prisoners coming into the system. So you got these ready-made depots, so they were reopened to sort of cope with the influx. And it wasn't considered such a threat of invasion at that time. By 1813, you've got about 20,000 enemy nationals situated in and around Portsmouth, a major naval base. And even though we think of Napoleon's major invasion threat of 1803, 1805 as being the big invasion scare, throughout this period, the Admiralty was getting intelligence about possible French landings all around the coastline of Britain. They got, in 1812, they got intelligence saying that there was going to be a force sailing from Antwerp to land on the east coast of England, march inland and rescue the prisoners at Norman Cross, and then raise merry hell in the countryside. And I'll tell the story later, but certainly in 1812, 1813, there was some intelligence that the French were planning a landing in the West Country to go inland and rescue the prisoners at Dartmoor Prison. There was always this threat of an invasion somewhere. They never actually came to fruition, but the Admiralty had to take it seriously. This scene is in Hampshire Museum Service, and it was painted by Captain Durrant of the Yorkshire Militia, who did duty at a number of these prison depots, and he painted the scenes around him. And this is the land gate, the main entrance to Portchester Castle, and that building, the guardhouse, remained up in situ until the 1960s, and the grounds was up to the local cricket club. So that's the sort of entrance that prisoners would have seen if they were marched into the land gate. And there's a postcard showing that guardhouse there in the 1960s. If you go to Portchester Castle, there's the land gate, there's the road going all the way through. The medieval part of the castle was used for housing captives. Here you've got the administrative buildings and the prison hospital, cookhouses, plus these wooden barracks. They're housing the prisoners of war. And Portchester Castle, as a war prison, is rather unique. It's the only war prison in history with a local parish church situated in its grounds. And throughout the period, that parish church was open to the public. It was found, however, on Sundays that some of these prisoners were taking advantage and using the parishioners coming and going to sort of actually help facilitate escapes. So they were all locked up in their barracks on a Sunday morning when the service was taking place. This shows this sort of structure of Portchester Castle as a prison depot. Some more examples of Durrant's paintings. This is in the Inner Bailey there. In the 1790s, Dutch were housed in the keep there, Spanish in Ashton's Tower, and French in those wooden barracks. After 1810, all the different nationalities came under the general heading of French prisoner of war, and so this all mixed in all the sort of barracks there. This one shows very nicely the palisade that ran along that road going along the centre of Portchester Castle. And these are the prisoners' market stalls there. So people could come in and trade with the prisoners each day and walk down that road. And you'd have a little sort of market atmosphere going on. There are a number of parole depots in Hampshire. Officers of the rank of second lieutenant and above were allowed their parole. And they signed a document to state that they would abide by the parole regulations and not attempt to escape if they could sort of live amongst the populations of these towns. And a lot of these parole depots have been in use throughout the 18th century as well. And these were sort of towns and villages that had ample accommodation. It might be sort of a number of taverns that could rent out some of the rooms to these officers. It might be private individuals that had a house or two that they could rent out to a group of French officers. So again, this brought a lot of a boost to the local economy. I've included Reading in this because I know that's not in Hampshire, but when a commissioner from the Transport Board would come and do a sort of tour of these depots, he'd include Reading in his remit as well. And you get the different nationalities. Note the dates 1811, 1812. I'll come on to why there were no French prisoners in these depots after that year, a little bit later on. But the parole regulations stated they were allowed to go no more than 1 mile outside of the town limits. They had to be in by sunset, weren't allowed out until sunrise, but otherwise they could mix with inhabitants. And they were given a 1 6 per day subsistence from the Transport Office, and from that they paid for their own rent and lodgings and food and so forth. And got some memories of some of their stays. I think Frenchman's Road got its name from some of the earlier conflicts in the 18th century, but still a some memory of French prisoners being housed at Petersfield. A couple of years ago, I visited Odium, and they were renovating this house, and unfortunately the new owners had taken off that sign there, which I think is a bit of a travesty. There's a little bit of history they could have kept there. But some of the cottages were given names, Frenchman's Cottage in Odium, because of that. They're allowed to go no more than 1 mile outside the parole, outside these sort of town limits. And where the milestone outside the town coincide with some natural feature, and that got linked to the sort of parole limit. So this is Frenchman's Oak on the Odium-Winchfield Road, coming out of Odium. And there's Frenchman's Bridge, about 1 mile outside of Bishop's Waltham as well. So these are additional markers of the parole limits. I've included this one. This is a nice little story to illustrate just the impact that these parole people would have upon a community. In 1810, Guadeloupe fell to British forces, and all the officers of the garrison, their wives, their children, their servants, including many black servants, their sort of administrative staff, was picked up from Guadeloupe, shipped across the Atlantic, then placed down into Alresford and Odium. So you've got these sort of diverse French communities all of a sudden appearing in Hampshire villages at that time, which must have been a sort of fascinating place to visit at that time. There's some gravestones in Alresford relating to some of these men and women. The 66th line was captured on Guadeloupe. There's, I'll put their eagle there, that's in the Royal Hospital in Chelsea. Ferron, he was in the 66th line. He died because he fell into the chalk pit, Odium, and broke his neck. Junot died of consumption. And when you look at the sort of death statistics of these men and women and children, you realize they are succumbing to all the illnesses, all the diseases that everybody was affected by at the time. Consumption took a lot of them to their grave at the time. Fever as well. When an outbreak of fever swept through a prison ship or a land depot, it affected not just the prisoners, but the crew of those ships and the soldiers of the garrison as well. So it affected the community, not just the prisoners themselves. These gravestones have recently been refurbished, so it's all worth a little visit there to see those. Unfortunately, the two in Odium, that picture is from the 1980s, and when I visited a couple of years ago, covered in lichen, and the sort of the lettering is no longer clearly visible. So those are the three depots. So prisoners of war spent many years in captivity. So what do they do with their time? Well, the most common activity, certainly in land prisons on board the prison ships, was making models from the bone from their meat ration. Now, this is a rather romantic idea of a prisoner in the bowels of a ship, making a whole model, the stub of a candle for illumination, making it all from start to finish himself. In actual fact, it was a highly organized activity. So a group of prisoners would come together and pool their talents. So someone might cut up the bone to make the hull. Someone might do the sort of fancy carving on the stern. And this chap's doing the rigging. And they'd pool their talents and they'd sell that model in the sort of prison market and then split the proceeds. Many of them are working models. Many of these guillotines, the blade actually comes down and lops off the head of the unfortunate victim. These ships quite often have a cord attached to a hole in the keel. You pull that cord and the guns go in and out to give a broadside effect. So I would suggest a lot of these are more executive toys. You know, if you're a Regency gentleman, you've invited your guests round, sort of supplied a nice dinner for them. After dinner, you retire to the study, the brandy and cigars, and you show off something you've bought in the local prison depot. Look at this model of a ship and the guns going in and out. And this is my particular favourite in Peterborough Museum, a bone cockerel, and all the feathers being individual strips of bone being carved and placed on there. And prisoners did so well out of making these models that many of them were able to employ other prisoners as servants and cooks. And there is one prisoner, Germain, who was at Forton prison at Gosport. He and a colleague specialised in making these bone ships, which they sold in the market for about 30 guineas a time, which was a lot of money then. When he went home to France in 1814, he took with him 160 guineas. He bought himself a small farm, married a local girl, and became a respected member of his community. So a lot of these men, I think a lot of this work is to help them get over the sort of trauma as modern service men and women. You take part in some archaeological digs, you know, Waterloo Uncovered, down on Salisbury Plain, to help them sort of get over the sort of post-traumatic stress and give them some sort of, you know, direction in life. I think this was the same case then. When you look at some of the men we know made these models, and you look at how they were captured, you realise they went through intense trauma before they arrived in a quiet prison depot, being fed consistently, accommodated, got consistent health care. They can sit down and make money out of making these models. One particular model, which I like to mention, the domino boxes. Dominoes as a game, and so becoming known in Europe by about 1780. It originated in the Far East, in China, but it was known mainly around the seaport towns of the Mediterranean. So a lot of seamen knew this game. And a lot of the bone models made by prisoners in the form of games boxes and domino boxes. And dealers would come into the prison depots and they'd buy up 10, 15, 20 of these domino boxes and then go and sell them in the taverns all around the country. The prisoners of war didn't invent the game, but they helped to promote it as a little pub game and as a board game in this country. So next time you play dominoes, remember there's a prisoner of war link to it. If you go to the basement of the keep at Portchester Castle, you'll see the remains of a very well organised prison theatre. In 1810, one Sergeant Beauchamp, who worked in the Paris theatrical business, obtained permission to use this room to construct a theatre, and English Heritage have recreated that theatre there and occasionally put on various events. And if you go into that room and look up, you'll see these oak beams with some of the original gold scroll work that the prisoners used to decorate it. They put on sort of dramas, musicals, melodramas, juggling acts, all sorts of things to entertain not only themselves, but soldiers of the garrison and some of the civilians who came in to watch the production. They had a 12-piece orchestra, and they had seating for 250 people in there, and it was a very successful. There were other theatres, a small one at Norman Cross, there was one at Dartmoor, and on some of the prison ships as well. There were small theatrical productions put on, but this was the most organised one. There were some illegal activities that prisoners all around the country got involved with. I'll come on to this. This is the one people home in on first, but I'll come on to that shortly. Straw plat. That was a major industry in the countryside. Straw plat being used to make sort of bonnets and baskets, and a wide variety of different articles out of straw. As the war progressed, straw plat and bonnets and so forth were taxed, and the tax increased. So dealers realised that they could keep their profits up and their costs down by using prisoners of war in the depots to make this straw plat. This was illegal because it took away the employment from the civilian workforce. Soldiers of the garrison would smuggle in the straw to be turned into plat and then smuggle the plat out again, wound around their bodies. And if soldiers were caught involved in this, they could receive the lash for their endeavours. So this was stamped out whenever it was discovered. It still went on because it was a lucrative trade for the prisoners to get involved with. Some prisoners realised they could make money by literally making money. And so forgery of banknotes, these early banknotes, became very evident in the early years of the Napoleonic Wars. In many of the prison depots, Norman Cross and Stapleton were two of the focal points of that. The forged banknotes were also found on board some of the prison ships in Portsmouth Harbour as well. Now, I've been told by one of the curators at the Bank of England Museum that some of the best forgeries of these early banknotes are made by prisoners of war using simple pen and ink. But forgery of banknotes was a capital offence. And if a prisoner could be proved to be forging these banknotes, he could face the gallows for it. And between 1803 and 1814, 27 prisoners of all different nationalities were hanged for being involved in forging banknotes. Now, this is one of the interesting asides of sort of the Royal Navy's story of the Napoleonic period, in that while the Admiralty is sending ships abroad to sort of prosecute the war and fight the big battles, they were getting a lot of anonymous correspondence from people all around the country complaining about the vast amount of obscene and depraved drawings and articles coming out of the depots, which one correspondent put was affecting the morals of the rising generation. This is a fairly simple one. It's a little manicure set, about 4 inches in length. Everything folds up. You've got this little sort of file up here, you've got a sort of toothpick there, something for cleaning your fingernails, and an ear scoop. No cotton buds in those days. You get a little bone ear scoop. Invariably, a lot of this pornography was done in the shape of punch. It was always associated with mischievous and malevolent humour. If you fold everything up and bring this ear scoop up into his hand, you've got something slightly different. And that's quite a tame one. I do have some photographs of a more explicit one on my phone if everyone wants to see it afterwards, but you have to show me proof you're over 18, though. But there was a lot of this in circulation at the time. And the Bristol-based Society for the Suppression of Vice was constantly complaining to the Admiralty about the vast amount of this material coming out of Stapleton Prison in Bristol. And what the authorities would do to try and stop it, if they could pin it down to a particular barrack or a particular deck on board a prison ship, they would sort of put in, the turnkeys and clerks would have their informants on board. And they sort of put out word, let us know, can you tell us who's involved in this? If no names are forthcoming, then certainly the land depots, the authorities would say, right, if you don't give us a name, that barrack won't have access to the market. It will affect all this sort of trade that barrack is doing. If that didn't work, on occasion they were threatened to close the market to the entire prison population. And that usually sort of brought forth a name who was then shipped off to one of the prison ships, and any money that he'd acquired and all his tools of the trade were confiscated from him. In the land prisons, there was a prison market. And these were the tourist attractions of the time. You know, you go to Portchester Castle, for example, you're going to have a picnic on Portsmouth Hill, then you travel down into either Forton Prison or Portchester Castle and see some of your erstwhile enemies at work and play. You take home a souvenir, a bone ship, or one of the automatons, or something else they'd made, or perhaps a little bit of lewd and indecent material, if that was your particular penchant. But this is another one of Durrant's paintings. You've got the palisade at Forton Prison at Gosport. The prisoners are on one side. They've got their market stalls or shops erected on the other side with all their wares for sale, and the local people are coming in to trade with them. And there's a very important employee of the depot there, the prison cat, these included in the picture. And it was said that some prisoners in some of the depots were taking sort of 200, 300, 400 guineas home with them when they were released in 1814. The prisoners did very well out of selling in these markets. If we take a look at the prisoner of war population, 1810, about 44,500 prisoners. And this expanded to the maximum total of 72,000 in 1813. But you'll note the following year, when Napoleon abdicated for the first time, there were only 45,000 left in the depots. Now, even though you've got Danes still coming in and Frenchmen still coming in and Americans as well, I estimate there's about 20,000 prisoners were released before the end of the war. So where did they go? This is all down to the exchange system. In the 1790s, a prisoner could expect to be in captivity for about a year and a half, 2 years maximum, because regular exchange cartels were set up between Britain and France and Spain and Holland. And we had good working relations even in the Napoleonic period with Spain, Denmark and Holland over the exchange of prisoners. Napoleon wasn't a diplomat, so from 1803 onwards, there were very few major exchanges between Britain and France. They tend to be low-key ones of merchant seamen, nothing really spectacular. 1810, you've got 44,500 French in Britain, but only 12,500 British in France. And the exchange system worked on the exchange for man, rank for rank. So an admiral could be exchanged for another admiral or a general, or have a common equivalent of 60 common men. You could mix and match your exchange system that way. But it didn't work very well with France because of this disparity in number. If that had taken place, if regular exchange cartels had taken place, there'd still be a disparity with a large number of French in this country. And by French, I mean sort of German, Dutch, Italian, everybody taken up in the sort of French army. There were some stumbling blocks with all the exchange negotiations that went on in this period. The first one, during the Peace of Amiens in 1802, many Britons flocked to France to see a continent that had been denied them for over a decade. When war broke out, Napoleon detained a lot of these men. They were sort of military men, naval men, they were sort of peers of the realm, they were businessmen, were all detained and sort of incarcerated at Verdun, albeit on parole and albeit living a comfortable life because they had access to money. But this was a sticking point with Britain, these détenus who were detained at the start of the war. When France overran Hanover in 1803, 1804, many thousands of those ex-Hanoverian soldiers came over to England to form the King's German Legion. Napoleon wanted to include those soldiers, ex-soldiers, in the exchange process, and Britain always said no to that, even though many thousands of them were finding their way into the King's German Legion. I'll speak a bit more about that in a minute. Now, because of that disparity in numbers, one of the obvious ways of getting around it was to include Spanish and Portuguese prisoners of war in exchange for prisoners in this country. Now, Britain initially said no to that. And then when the negotiations were obviously going to founder, they sort of agreed to it. Well, then Napoleon had another bright idea. He kept throwing in new spanners in the works for these exchanges. He suggested that the Royal Navy supply the ships to take all those prisoners from France back to Spain and Portugal. And it was then that the negotiations broke down. And this was happening in 1810 and then slightly more in 1812 as well. And all that time, there were more and more prisoners coming into the system from the Peninsular War, the War of 1812 with America, and the war in the Baltic with Denmark. And so from 1810 to 1814, you start to see a lot of overcrowding on board the prison ships and in the depots. And that's why you get more depots being opened up in the north of England and Scotland. So who was to blame for this lack of exchange of prisoners of war? Well, he had no one to blame but himself. Many soldiers and seamen remained in captivity because he kept putting his oar in when it came to exchange negotiations. They kept foundering. So all these soldiers and seamen were denied Napoleon to get back to France and fight in his war machine, but were available to other countries. Before I go on to that in detail, I'll just mention this chap and show you the sort of problems that faced the Transport Office regarding prisoners of war. I mentioned earlier that a lot of the parole depots were emptied of their sort of French captives by 1811, 1812, and they were moved up north. It was mainly because of this man, General Edouard Francois Seamen, who was captured at Busaco in September 1810. He arrived at Odium and almost immediately set up clandestine correspondence with other officers in the parole depots in Hampshire and around the country as well. And it was him who was actually sort of sounding out officers on parole down in the West Country to see if it was possible to have an invasion down there to release the prisoners at Dartmoor. He was also encouraging escape routes to be set up all along the south coast of England. And this is when the smuggling gangs of the south coast upped their game and making a lot of money out of helping prisoners to escape. So Odium, Alresford and Bishop's Waltham were the sort of hotbeds of this sort of prisoner escape system at that time. You've got to remember, 1810 to 1812, you've still got invasion threats going on around the country. You've got the Luddite riots taking place up in the north of England, and troops were having to be sent up there to help the magistrates maintain law and order. And troops had to be found for the peninsula as well. So having this chap gathering intelligence, and it was obvious that sort of French officers were actually spying on sort of dockyards and sort of military establishments around the country, that it came to he actually escaped from Odium, was captured in London and sent to Dumbarton Castle. And a lot of the sort of smuggling gangs were sort of broken up. One of the ways they sort of countered it with the smugglers was if you were a smuggler involved in helping the enemy to escape, the penalty for that was being sent to Botany Bay. If you spilled the beans and told them what had happened and let them know who the accomplices were, how the scheme was run, you get a lesser sentence. You might get sort of a year in the town jail or a hefty fine. So it makes for interesting reading, because all those smugglers who were caught aiding and abetting people like Seamen in helping prisoners to escape, their reports are very, very detailed. They told everything. They spilled the beans and named names because they weren't going down to Botany Bay. So this is why, because there were so many prisoners arriving in the south of England, they were involved in this escape matters and intelligence gathering. By 1812, all the parole depots were emptied of their French officers and they were sent up to depots in the north of England and Scotland. Now, with all this going on, did the prisoners really care about the lack of exchange? Officers did. By 1810, when the exchange system, exchange negotiations founded, you get more prisoners, more officer prisoners breaking their parole and escaping, mainly because they were seeing their careers pass them by. They were sitting there in a parole depot for years on end, and they weren't going anywhere. And so their careers under the great Napoleon are stagnating. So you get more escapes taking place after 1810. And the smugglers were encouraging them. If they had money, the smugglers would go out looking for them. For the ordinary soldiers and seamen, it was a comfortable life in the prison depot, getting fed and clothed and accommodated, getting healthcare, being able to make money. So why worry about lack of exchange? Some did. While many didn't, some did. And while Napoleon didn't get those men back, Britain was able to take advantage of this recruiting ground. They were allowed to recruit Germans and Dutch, but not Italians of dubious character nor Frenchmen. Now, I don't know what an Italian of dubious character is like, I don't know, but Germans and Dutch were fair game for recruitment, and many thousands of them found their way into the King's German Legion, the various émigré corps, the Chasseurs Britanniques, the Royal Navy, the Marines, the Merchant Service picked up recruits as well. Even the whole herring fishery acquired a number of neutral seamen to work up in the sort of fishing vessels up there as well. So this got the prisoners out of the system and reduced the cost of the system. It also helped to boost the strength of Britain's forces as well. If you were a colonel of a militia regiment doing duty at Portchester Castle, for example, and you wanted to make your percussion section look really smart, and this was the fashion at the time to dress them in semi-oriental uniform, you'd recruit 1 or 2 black prisoners from the depot and give them some cymbals or drums or a jingling Johnny and put them ahead of your band. It would look really smart. And Portchester Castle does have a very interesting exhibition there relating to the black prisoners who were housed in the castle in the 1790s. But many hundreds of black prisoners were enlisted by militia regiments who did duty at all the depots. So the end is nigh. And what showed the world that sort of Napoleon was on the way out is retreat from Russia and the Battle of Leipzig. Because after the Battle of Leipzig, many German states found themselves part of the coalition against Napoleon. And so they started to rebuild their armies. So the Admiralty was getting correspondence from, say, the Grand Duke of Hesse, literally asking for his army back because it had been captured in the peninsula and was being housed in the prison depots of this country. And the Admiralty was very happy to do so because you got prisoners out of the system. Prisoners were coming in all the time, but it got them out of it. It reduced the cost of the system. It was good for diplomacy, and it helped to sort of bolster the armies that were now fighting against Napoleon. One of the nations that acquired many thousands of recruits from the prison depots was the newly forming Dutch army. Now, when William Frederick of Orange landed in November 1813 back in Holland, the first thing he did was start building up a Dutch army to sort of fight Napoleon. And 2 Dutch officers were sort of situated in Hampshire to go into Portchester Castle and Fort and the prison ships and actively recruit Dutch and Germans for the fledgling army of King William. Seamen also volunteered for the army, so it wasn't just soldiers and seamen who volunteered for an army like that, but seamen decided on a career change and became soldiers. And interestingly, these men were collected in batches of 600 at Sheerness, which is basically a battalion, I suppose, and then sent to Holland to sort of fight under the coalition's banner. And this was also happening in Russia and Germany. Russia had taken large numbers of sort of Germans and Dutch in the 1812 campaign there. And so many of those were recruited into this newly formed army. Napoleon, therefore, was denied these men. While thousands of them came to Hampshire, were housed here and looked after, if he'd been a bit more willing to sort out the exchange process between Britain and France, then many of those men would have gone back and been available to him. But as it was, many thousands of them, in Hampshire especially, became available to these forces arrayed against him. So many of the men held in the prison depots in Hampshire helped in his final demise in 1814. And that, ladies and gentlemen, brings me to the end of my presentation. Before we go, there's a little advert, some books for sale out there, £15, and I'm giving them away at that price.
Another fascinating subject I knew absolutely nothing about. So thank you very much indeed.
Okay, right.
Time, thank you. A little bit of time for questions. If I could ask you to stick your hand up so that Michael can shove a microphone under your nose, because we've got Zoomers listening as well, and they can't hear the questions unless you do that. So, any questions? Where are you? There you go.
Thanks. We're local to Odium, And there's the quarry there, which I think may be the chalk pit.
Chalk pit, yeah.
Was that something that the French prisoners worked in, or were they actually held there?
And no, they were held mainly in the High Street in Odeon. There's a lot of buildings there. They were either billeted with people who rented out a room or two to them, or they hired houses and you get groups of 4 or 5 prisoners. They didn't actually work in the chalk pit. Prisoners of war weren't allowed outside the depots, and certainly in the parole depots, to work on building projects or quarrying or whatever. It took away employment of the civilian workforce. So Ferron was just probably going for a country walk, and out of curiosity looked over the edge, and unfortunately that was the end of him. Yeah, they didn't actually. I know there are cottages there, and I'm not sure whether they actually lived in. I know they lived in the High Street in Odeon.
So just one follow-up. My only knowledge of ships of the time is the Victory in Portsmouth. Were the prison ships of a similar size?
Yeah, they were all usually sort of 74-gun ships, not quite the sort of first rates, but sort of 74-gun ships. And somebody at the Admiralty had a rather macabre sense of humour, because if they sort of captured a ship from the French or the Dutch, the French ships would have French put on board, and these Dutch ships would have Dutchmen put on board, and same with the Danes as well. So whether they thought they might be familiar with that ship or not, I don't know. Well, it was just rubbing it in a bit. But, yeah.
Paul, I was just struck by what you said about the difference in standard between what the prisoners could expect in terms of food and conditions and the general population. Was there any treaty or something like that that underpinned the standard of treatment that was to be given to prisoners, or was it just a self-regulating?
It was based on the possible exchange. If there was any hint that prisoners were being mistreated either side of the Channel, then that would put a stop to any exchange negotiations taking place, even though there were major reasons for the exchange not happening. And also the government's political opponents would beat them around the head with a stick to say, you're not prosecuting the war properly. Prisoners of war aren't being looked after in this country, so that's causing the lack of exchange with France. And so another reason was that prisoners of war who were in poor health and no longer fit for active service would be sent home automatically. The British did that. They sent home many thousands during this period. The French sent back 13 because they wanted to keep that number of possible exchange. And so it was the best option was to keep these prisoners in good health. So you've got them sitting in the prison depots, so you can actually exchange them for prisoners in health on the other side of the Channel. That was the thinking behind it. Unfortunately for Britain, it just meant that prisoners were backing up in this country, and it was costing more and more, to keep them there. It was 1780 when that exchange treaty was set up between Britain and France, and that was the one that was applied during the 1790s and Napoleonic period. It was based around the exchange, keeping the prisoners in good health so you can exchange them for healthy prisoners out in France. Right.
Oh, brilliant communication.
Question from Zoom. A bit of a long shot, but do you happen to know of the presence of or any notable examples of French officers staying in houses, taverns or similar in the vicinity of Alton, Crondall and Farnham?
They were not parole depots. I don't have any specific examples that I can sort of give you for those. Certainly French officers passed through them on their way to parole depots. Residing there, no, I don't have any examples. Right.
Just one from me. Is there any evidence of how many prisoners stayed behind and settled in the United Kingdom?
Yeah, that's a question. People often ask me that, and it's as the more I do this research, and the more people do their family history research, the more I realise there are more and more who actually did stay behind. There are documented cases of officers in a lot of the parole depots who were mixing with the community, falling in love and sort of marrying local girls. After the war was over, some of them went back to France and took their new wives with them, and then came back to this country because they didn't like the political situation or economic situation. Some of them decided to stay on. An example, there was a Leon Chasteauneuf. And this is a particular story because a few years ago, when I was in work, I was working alongside a lady who had the surname Chasteauneuf. She told me that her husband could trace his origins back to Leon Chasteauneuf, who was captured on board the Duguay Trouin who was at Trafalgar and had taken it on the 4th of November afterwards. And he was sent to Crediton on parole, married a local girl, Mary Feltham, decided he liked it there, and he stayed on in the country and became a professor of languages in Greenwich. So he's quite a well-documented case, but there are other documented cases around the country as well. And also, I mentioned that sort of a lot of black prisoners were recruited into the regimental bands. When these militia regiments were disembodied after the war, what happened to those black prisoners? They didn't have the money to go back to the West Indies or wherever they were captured. So many of them would have stayed on in the country. So I think you'll find a lot of prisoners who were recruited were disbanded in this country and may have stayed on afterwards. And we have to rely on sort of prisoners, people doing their family history to bring those stories to light. I think, yes, in answer to your question, and I think there are a lot more stories that will come out in the future. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Oh, one last one.
Thank you. You mentioned that the prisoners were given a daily allowance of 1 6. How did that compare to the rate pay the local people?
A labourer might be earning a shilling, 2 shillings a day, depending on what he was doing. So that was 1 shilling and 6 that they had to find their own food, clothing, lodging, and they brought in their own money as well. They could get remittances from France too. So it was considered to be sufficient for them to pay for their rent and their food. Anything else, they have to find the money themselves by. Some of them sort of took up fencing lessons, dancing.
Were there any prison ships where the prisoners revolted?
Yes, there were some riots on the Sampson prison ship in Chatham, and some prisoners were getting a bit uptight about being kept on the deck. If you can imagine prisoners being confined to that orlop deck, not just at night. If you've got a so heavy winter of 1812, 1813, there's no way they're going up on deck because 3 foot of snow up there. And so some of them got a little bit frustrated at being confined below decks like that. And there were occasional riots amongst the prisoners and deaths amongst them as well. And especially in 1808, when all of a sudden Spain became our allies, and a lot of the French considered the Spanish were traitors. And so there were a few riots, certainly at Fortin prison, between the Spanish and the French. A lot of the French who could speak Spanish tried to mix themselves in with the Spanish going home. And so there were some serious riots taking place there. And you'd find prisoners committed murder. If they didn't like a particular colleague or something or got into an argument, they'd fight duels in the prison depots. It was all sticks with a sort of scissor blade on the end as a rapier. And prisoners died because of that. So yes, prisoners did die in riots on board some of the prison ships and the depots, and from various acts of violence as well. Yeah.
Yeah, what was the rationale for bringing back prisoners that were captured in the peninsula rather than keeping them in Portugal, for example?
Because there was a well-organised system in this country to look after them. They would come here to the Dartmoor prison, Portchester Castle, Perth prison, that was ready set up to accommodate them. And the idea was that if there were regular exchange cartels set up, then they would come back to this country and then go back to France. There just weren't the facilities to sort of feed, clothe and guard them out in the peninsula. There were occasionally local exchanges of officers that took place out in the peninsula, but otherwise the prisoners were quickly marched back to Lisbon, from Lisbon to either sort of Plymouth, Portsmouth, from 1812 up to Perth prison directly. So there was no facilities out in Spain to look after them.
Did the officers get a greater allowance than did the officers get a greater allowance than the average soldier?
The soldiers and the seamen in the prison depots were being fed and clothed and accommodated by the actual system itself. The officers on parole were given this 1 shilling and 6. They had to find their own accommodation and food, clothing, and so forth. So they had the liberty of choosing what they ate, where they ate, and who they sort of lived with at the time. And that was considered part of the sort of gentleman's agreement. You give them an allowance to help them out. When the war was over, we got back £8 million in reparations from the French for housing all their prisoners over here. So we got our money back.
Thank you.